Welcome to the 76th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Saladin Ahmed, author of the new fantasy novel, Throne of the Crescent Moon. Well, welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Saladin Ahmed, author of the new fantasy novel, Throne of the Crescent Moon, which is available in bookstores now. Saladin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, well, if the listeners haven't heard about your new novel yet, can you give them a sense of what Throne of the Crescent Moon is all about without giving away too much?
Sure. Well, the character that we just got a brief glimpse of, Adula Makslood, is a monster hunter, as it were, who is living in a kind of quasi-Arabian city near the end of his retirement as a monster hunter. And slowly we see a bigger cast and a wider kind of panorama of the world. And it's a sort of Arabian Nights meets the kind of classic, or to some people, malignable, wide-eyed 80s fantasy, and meets the new gritty kind of fantasy, I guess. There's little pinches of all of that thrown together in there.
Sure. Well, as you described the kind of Arabian setting of Throne of the Crescent Moon, I was curious, what led you to that kind of setting for your fantasy novel? And were there any particular novels or movies or even other creative works that inspired you as you were working on Throne of the Crescent Moon?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess the main reason would just be my own personal background. I grew up in an Arab American community just outside Detroit, and that's part of my heritage is the sort of mythology and the religion and the culture and the food and the sound and the language and things like that. Even though I was born here, my own Arabic sucks, is almost non-existent. That's the cultural context I grew up in. But the other cultural context I grew up in is I was a nerdy, bookish American kid in the 80s. And so I was playing Dungeons and Dragons and reading comic books and reading Dragonlance and The Hobbit and, all those influences that probably a lot of listeners had in their lives early on. And it's a sort of mixing of those two. It's sort of where Throne of the Crescent Moon came from. It's also, though, because I'm 37 almost, it's also, an attempt as a grown-up to wrangle with some of the stuff that was in those fantasy novels as well, and that was in my culture as well. And so it's been kind of called a throwback book, and there's some truth to that. I did sort of pay homage to the fantasy I grew up with, but it's also a kind of pushback against that fantasy, and that's what fueled a lot of the writing of it. As far as the choice of setting, other than my own kind of personal background, it's also just kind of interesting to me to explore something that hasn't been done a whole lot. I mean, it's hardly the first book to use this setting. Not that older books from Frank Herbert on have sort of been influenced by Middle Eastern culture, Arab culture, Islamic culture. More recently, Howard Andrew Jones's excellent Desert of Souls, has explored this territory. So it's not like this is brand new stuff, but it's certainly less traveled ground than the kind of quasi-European fantasy. So, part of me just as a writer, regardless of my background, is interested in exploring something different.
Sure. And you just mentioned that kind of quasi-European or medieval setting. Have you given much thought as to why we see so many fantasies with that setting? Do you think that writers are simply returning to somewhat of a setting or tone that was familiar to them and possibly brought them joy initially as readers?
Well, it's always kind of bizarre to me because there's this idea that, somehow, for lack of a more specific term, somehow white people are going to be naturally inclined to like Western fantasy, as if some kid growing up in Newark somehow has anything in common whatsoever with elves in a kind of idealized medieval Britain. it's that's not that kid's culture any more than medieval Arabia is that kid's culture, and so it's reading habits. But I think that really what needs to be deconstructed there is just kind of the whole idea that one equals one in terms of I wrote this book because I'm this, and people identify with this book because they're that,
Sure. Well, I also wanted to follow up because you discussed just a minute or two ago about being born in an Arab immigrant community in Detroit, and I was just curious a little bit about your own personal background. I mean, you talked about loving the fantasy novels of the '80s and playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I know that, and I don't want to make too broad of an assumption here, but I know that in some immigrant communities, especially if you were going to say like the first or second generation in the U.S., there tends to be a huge focus on being very practical and succeeding financially, and sometimes creative and artistic pursuits may be frowned upon. I wonder in your own kind of in your own childhood, what was what was your own experience? Because I know for myself, and obviously I'm not from an Arab community, but I can certainly relate to the other part of your equation of growing up in the '80s and reading many of the novels then and playing Dungeons and Dragons. But I'm curious about your own kind of experience.
Well, I think, on the one hand, there's some truth behind this generalization, but it is a broad generalization. And, I think that really, you could say that about pretty much most parents. I mean, I guess, if we were to narrow it down and say that the, middle to upper class white intellectuals are more open to their kids, becoming writers or something like that, that might be true. But, broadly speaking, I teach adjunct English classes at universities, often freshman comp classes, freshman creative writing classes.
Right.
See a lot of 19, 20-year-olds, and been sort of varied universities, but often with kind of working class populations. And, these kids, whatever their kind of ethnic or racial background, they're not being given the option by their families of pursuing something as fluffy as writing,
Right.
And but generation does have something to do with it. My dad went through a lot of the struggles with his dad, who was the immigrant, that I saw my friends go through with their parents who were immigrants, which meant that my dad was a kind of very counterculture American, very Arab, but also very American guy, who was, had me listening to The Clash when I was a little kid, and was very, very, very supportive of me always being creative. We didn't have tons of money, so we thought about money, and so he talked to me realistically about how hard it was to try and make a living, writing, and and boy was he right. But he when I was in first grade, he used to have me write a little story or comic for him every day during the summer when I was out of school to kind of keep me fresh, keep those muscles working,
Well, that's great. And, that actually leads into my next question. I was going to ask you when you, we talked about, reading fantasy novels and playing Dungeons and Dragons, but when did you first begin your own kind of writing? It sounds like pretty early. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I did all sorts of little, goofy comics and stories and stuff when I was, when I was very young. I thought I could draw. I think I moved towards prose almost exclusively, such as it was like in junior high, and I was writing my corny little stories that no one will ever see. They're not extant. I think I probably tore them all up when I was in high school. And some of them were genre stuff. A lot of them were genre tinged stuff. But really, I got a serious start as a writer, as a poet, and I spent about 5 to 10 years, I guess, my sort of early 20s to my late 20s, performing and publishing poetry. And I only turned to science fiction and fantasy in the past. It's been about 4 years now.
Mm-hmm.
Started by publishing some short stories, most of which are actually free online on my website, or links to them on my website, and then worked on the novel. So it's novel took about 3.5 years to write.
And what was the path to publication like for you in getting Throne of the Crescent Moon published?
I'm very lucky that it went pretty smoothly for me. I have a lot of friends who are writers, a lot of mentors who are veteran writers, and there's just 100,000 different ways. Some of them very, very long and tortuous that books find their way to being published. And I had a pretty lucky experience, pretty fortunate experience in terms of I found writing teachers very early when I was kind of doodling a manuscript at first. Walter John Williams primarily among them, who helped me kind of both hone what I was doing and look for making connections with people so I would be ready when I had something. And my excellent agent Jennifer Jackson kind of talked to me early based on the short fiction. So she took a look at the manuscript and decided to represent me. And pretty swiftly after that, Betsy Woolheim-Adaw, who was pretty much my dream editor, bought the books. So it was much better books than mine. Far better books than mine have had a much longer path to publication. So it's a lot of it's just a dice throw.
Sure.
At the right time.
Well, given your success thus far with having your novel published and your short stories as well, what tips or advice would you offer for aspiring writers, people who are maybe where you were 5 or 6 years ago?
Well, the bulk of it is just getting better as a writer, and that's which. Not for everyone in the world, but I think for most people, is connected to being connected to other people. I do a novel critique service when I'm not teaching at university. I do a freelance novel critique service, and I talk to writers all the time about kind of making their work better by having people look at it. Even if they're not going to hire a professional editor to have critique groups that they work with or groups of friends that they work with so that the thing passes under lots of sets of eyes. Throne of the Crescent Moon would never have been published if there hadn't been tons of beta readers for it, and I hadn't made it better and better and better. So, just that kind of connection, which kind of folds into kind of networking with people, which one wants to do in a social way without being overbearing.
Right.
And just the kind of those two things coming together. But probably the biggest kind of connection I can suggest is to read and read and read and read. And it's kind of surprising how many people who have kind of written a novel haven't read very many novels. And unsurprisingly, those who've read a lot of novels generally tend to be the better writers. Not always, but generally.
And that kind of leads into a question. Who are some of the writers that you enjoy reading, either now or in the past?
Well, like I say, Throne of the Crescent Moon is definitely influenced by very specific books. first three Dragonlance books, actually, from the 80s, by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, were pretty formative for me, actually. And, later I found out, of course, that there was some derivative stuff in there, like there isn't in every book. But, I reread them recently, and they really hold up for me personally, in terms of some of the characters, the pathos, and this idea of a diverse set of characters that has these kind of all these varying internal battles going on as they're fighting monsters, basically, is a fun one and a kind of powerful one in a weird way. And that was one of the books that kind of inspired me on that level. But there are tons of books. I mean, I spent far too many years in a graduate English program, so I've got tons of literary influences. I mean, my favorite novel, despite my love for all the kind of 80s pulpy stuff, my favorite novel is Moby Dick. So, there's an influence there. There's a kind of Walt Whitman homage in Burn of the Crescent Moon. So it's hard for me to say where one influence ends and one begins, but there's a lot of stuff in there too.
Sure. And what was your reaction? You just mentioned, being in these graduate level literature classes and writing classes. What was the reaction to some of your choice of material in terms of more fantasy and science fiction oriented?
Well, when I was in graduate school doing my MFA, I was doing it in poetry. So
right, okay.
I actually did have a lot of subject matter that was still kind of fantasy and a little less so SF. But there were Valkyries and werewolves and djinn and things like that in my poems. But it was poetry, so people were open to that. And fiction, I think nowadays it's probably a little bit different with people like Michael Chabon and all sorts of other people. Making it up for people to do that. I think there's probably more now than there was 10 years ago being written in MFA programs. But I think there's also a stereotype of the MFA program. Most of them are not equipped to deal with genre fiction, but there's good and bad MFA fiction. There's good and bad MFA teachers, just like anything else. There's good and bad genre fiction being written. So.
And what has been the process for you moving between short stories and the novel? Did you find there to be any differences there?
I've heard other writers sort of really talk about pretty dramatic differences for them, and not so much for me. I really, even though I started publishing with short stories, I had written, big chunks of the novel before I even started to write short stories. It was sort of like I wrote some of the novel, then I wrote some short stories, and I wrote some of the novel, wrote some short stories. And for me, most of the difference is just about length. It's about sort of taking a very long time to get a kind of satisfying conclusion to what you're creating, and having to work for a lot more days doing it. And I think the fact that that's mostly how I wrote the first book is probably a pointer to some of its weaknesses. I think, I think it's pretty apparently the book of a first-time novelist who's come from writing short stories, and or at least perfecting short stories, or honing them, not perfecting them, before learning how to hone a novel. I don't think the pacing in the novel is perfect. But I think it's taught me a lot. Writing this first novel taught me a lot about what I'm going to do in book 2. And they are different beasts to some degree. There's something different about them other than just a difference in length. And I'm looking forward to kind of exploring more fully what that difference is as I write book 2.
Right. And is that what you're working on now, book 2?
Yeah, well, that and mostly taking care of my twin toddlers. So I'm working on book 2 when I'm not critiquing manuscripts for clients or chasing the toddlers around the house. I'm working on book 2. It's coming on.
Yeah. That can be a full-time job sometimes, I know.
Indeed.
The chasing toddlers.
Yes. Yeah. Well, two at one time, especially.
Yeah, I can't imagine. So, where can people find out more about you online?
My website is saladinahmed.com. That's SALADINAHMED.com. There's links there to all the various social medias stuff, and then pretty much under that name all over the web, Twitter, Facebook, etc., etc. I'm on Twitter quite a lot. I update there more often than I do on my own blog, which is probably not how I should be doing things.
Okay, well, again, we've been speaking with Saladin Ahmed, author of the new novel Throne of the Crescent Moon, and the book is available in bookstores now or as an ebook, so definitely check it out. Saladin, thanks for doing the interview.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to my latest podcast. If you have a chance, please leave a review of the podcast in iTunes. It only takes a moment. Until next time, read some good books and be well.
A college degree was in your future. Then life took a different turn. Jump back into school with confidence in a program designed for adults like you. Experience the support of a personal enrollment counselor. They'll walk with you through every step of the enrollment process. Move smoothly from one course to the next, with books delivered right to you before each course. Returning to school can be seamless when you have the right support. Thrive without ceasing. Start today at adult.cornerstone.edu.
You know Hardee's made from scratch biscuits and hand-breaded chicken. It's time you try them with hot honey. Taste the sweet heat for yourself with the new hot honey hand-breaded chicken biscuit at Hardee's.
Feed your happy. Available for a limited time at participating Hardee's restaurants. Hot honey hand-breaded chicken biscuit is available during regular breakfast hours. Price of participation may vary.